everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the Summer Institute for Garden-Based Teaching. This session is on outdoor classroom management, and I hope there's going to be a lot of excellent tools for you all to use as you head back into school gardens in the future. Just a little bit of an overview. Laura, if you can go to the next slide. The Summer Institute as a whole, we are over halfway through the Summer Institute. This is Thursday, July 30th, and this is our outdoor classroom management. But we also have next Tuesday's discussion, especially relevant right now, will be on how we use school gardens as a tool for our COVID response, followed by Thursday's August 6th webinar, Teaching in the School Garden, Standards-Based Curriculum in Creative Ways in the School Garden. And then Tuesday, the final discussion session on Tuesday, August 11th, is on curriculum brainstorming. So this is your opportunity to come with what you want to teach through your school garden, whether that is virtual or in person, and brainstorm with other teachers to support you in doing that. Next slide, please. Just some general housekeeping for today's session. This webinar is being recorded, so please make sure to mute your audio. We will upload this webinar to our course website on Schoology, and then later it will go onto YouTube with automatic captioning as well. Please answer any questions that you have into the chat box, and we will get to those questions during the question and answer at the end. And then just a reminder for everybody that we are using slido.com again to ask some poll questions throughout. So I just threw into the chat box the slido.com website, and then the code for today is 31884, and the first question is already there. Laura, next slide. So today, we've got three excellent presenters. Emma Boel from City Blossoms, their School Garden Partners Coordinator. She has been a garden-based educator for several years, and she works with teachers at City Blossoms partner schools to maintain and teach in their school gardens, including teaching lessons directly to classes and co-teaching alongside teachers. Willa Pohlman is the Director of Programming and Training for City Blossoms and has been a garden-based educator there since 2011. She has supported the City Blossoms School Garden Partners program since the beginning and really helped them revamp that program 4 years ago. And then my name is Brianne. I will be presenting today as well. I'm the Director of Programs for Friends of the National Arboretum and Washington Youth Garden, and I have nearly 15 years of informal and formal education experience in museums, in nature centers, and as an elementary school science teacher. So I've been thrilled to support Washington Youth Garden in their garden science school garden programs since I joined the team in 2017. And I really love bringing all the variety of educational experiences and work that I've had into our school garden spaces. Next slide. I just wanted to give you all one slide to sort of think about how we think about teaching in our school garden. What are our values around teaching there? So first, we always try to ensure that our focus is student-centered. So instead of us sharing everything that we might possibly want to know, we want to cue into where are the students' interests, where are their passions, and how does that connect with what we're trying to get across. In addition, we focus on exploratory education, so really allowing experiences to guide the learning and explore together, questioning, figuring it out together using inquiry in our school garden spaces. Of course, one of the benefits of teaching in the school garden is it should be engaging and enthusiastic and positive with a real focus on active and hands-on learning. And then, of course, anytime you're outside, it has to be flexible. Weather changes, the number of students you might have might change, and there are so many different variables that you could expect. Your tomato plants that did great last week that you designed a whole lesson around may have gotten eaten or gotten a disease in that past week. So you have to be a little nimble. And then, of course, what's the benefit of doing school garden-based programs if it's not also a little bit fun? There's more space for joyous and lighthearted focus, and a focus more on games and play as a learning tool as well. So when we at Washington Youth Garden think about our teaching outside, these are what we try to keep in mind as we plan our spaces, and also as we plan how we will use those spaces. Next slide, please. What are we going to talk about today? So today there's a beginning, a little bit of a follow-up from what we talked about in the garden design webinar, where we talked about what features do we have in school gardens, but this focus is much more on how do you use these tools? What is the functionality of different components in your school garden? Then we'll dive into lesson planning and how we think about configuring our garden-based teaching to be able to successfully provide a wide variety of experiences, and how that impacts outdoor group management. And then the last piece is we will talk about tone setting and how we set the field for when we're going to go out into our school gardens, which is perhaps the most important thing you can do for outdoor group management. And then we'll finish up with a question and answer session. So all your questions that you're coming up with, they can go in that chat box, and we'll get to them at the very end. Next slide, please. Before I speak to this, let's see real quick if we've gotten any answers to our initial poll question. We've gotten some, so I'm just gonna share my screen real fast so you all can see. Okay, if you haven't already added and you want to, we're answering our first Slido.com poll question, and the course code that you'll need for that is 31884. And here are some of the things that people have brought up as some of the challenges that they face with group management in their garden. And in open space, it's hard to have the little ones focus on one activity. Yeah, an inadequate understanding of the expectations outdoors, confusions about recess rules, teachers who feel like they need to be in control, and the weather can be too hot or too cold, ensuring people are able to be hands-on, of course, an excitement to be outside, seating, having enough manpower. It's really hard when there's so much space and wind to be able to make sure everybody can hear you. Getting students focused, and children getting excited and damaging some plants. I have a feeling that we are going to touch on a whole lot of these today. So thank you everybody for everything that you added in here, including play space versus exploratory space, and what things can be hands-on and what things should we observe first. Okay, Laura, if you can head back to the slides. Okay, so as I mentioned today, our focus on what role does design play is to really think not so much about what are the physical features that you need in your garden, but how do you use those? How functionally does that fit into how you use your garden space? And so to kick that off, I am going to pass it over to the City Blossoms team. Next slide.
Awesome, thank you so much, Brianne. We are really excited to be here today. As Brianne mentioned, my name is Willa. I'm the Director of Programming and Trainings at City Blossoms. And I'm really excited to talk about signage because I get really excited about signage. It sometimes feels kind of daunting and overwhelming, and I think can sometimes be thought of as a last thing to add, but it can be a really key tool in being able to communicate the sort of what, why, when, how of the garden, make sure that the space is activated even when it's wintry and not as exciting in there, and make stronger ties to sort of your neighbors and the school community so everyone knows what's happening. I think it can also be a really key piece in making sure that the students who are the main experts and gardeners in this space really have their hand in making and showing their expertise in a space. All right, next slide, please. These are a few helpful questions that we like to sort of use as a jumping off point, either if you're just starting to think about signage or you've looked at your signage and you're like, I think we need to add on here or make things a little different. So thinking about who's creating the art, how to create art, especially if you're working with really young kids, that also feels like something you're excited to have up in the garden and that communicates the things that you're trying to communicate. Thinking about your space kind of as, how are you branding your space? How is the signage tying the space together? So thinking about if you're using a set of colors, if you're using a set of shapes, and we're gonna dive into a few more examples of that in a second. Also thinking about all of how art and signs can make cultural connections in your space, and thinking about sort of storytelling and expression as well. So for the very top picture where you've got some really cute little pre-K kids painting a sign, this is a good example of, these kids were only in pre-K 3, and we used masking tape to sort of define the background of the sign. And then using really small paintbrushes and some pre-outlined letters, they were actually able to do all of that lettering on that sign. Just below that is from DC International School. They really wanted their signage to reflect sort of the logo of DCI, as well as all the languages that are focused on at DCI. And we cut out the shapes. We were not able to pull off a 3-headed dragon, but we did pull off 3 dragon heads, and then they were able to write welcome in Chinese, Spanish, and French. So these are sort of examples of different ways in which schools have decided to go about reflecting the needs of students and starting their signage off. Next slide, please. All right, this is a sign installation from Van Ness Elementary. And they also decided their theme based on the logo of the school and also their proximity to the river. And so once they decided that they wanted to have an otter incorporated, students helped pick out some blues and greens that contrasted nicely. And so those wave shapes and the sort of water plants are sort of the theme throughout the garden, whether it's a rules sign or something inspiring. The shapes sort of occur across the garden. And then the interesting thing about this space is it's an example of, they're right up on M Street in Southeast, and they're at a really busy street. And so the signage also provides sort of this slight barrier to the road, and also makes it so that people walking past can kind of get a sense of what's happening and what's going on at the school garden. And actually, one interesting thing about this, which was the first time we had tried this out, is all the texture on the signs. The students took dowels and straws and dipped them in paint, and they created sort of water bubbles that are on each of the waves as the background. And then on the seaweed, they used masking tape to kind of create that pattern as well. So it's sort of a good example of ways that different tools while painting can make painting feel a little less overwhelming and a little easier if you're working with a large group of students. All right, next slide. All right, so we love to encourage people to use sort of shapes and colors that feel cohesive in the space and try to have some form of signage that's inviting, inspiring, and innovative. This page is some example of some different ideas for inviting signage. So having something right at the front of the garden that lets people know they're welcome, make sure that the languages are reflective of your school community, so that people can more easily understand how they can be involved, when the garden's open, if there's any events coming up. So to the right, you can see Kelly Miller Middle School students updating the sign in front of the farm at Kelly Miller. And we found it super helpful to use blackboard paint at a lot of our entrance signs so that anything that changes super regularly can be easily updated. And they're using a chalkboard marker that stays up for a good part of the season. Sometimes by the end of the year, it'll get a little bit faded, but that's a really easy way to keep things up to date and also let people know sort of what's happening and how to get involved. We tend to use 3/4-inch CDX plywood for our signs just because that's what we found lasts for a while, and we have a way of sort of managing it pretty easily. There's lots of different ways to do things and lots of great ways to do things. So I think everyone figures out what's best for their school and their staff. If you are using wood, I would definitely recommend looking into non-toxic outdoor acrylic paint. We've typically used folk art paint, which has got nice bright colors, which are all exhibited on these signs. And then sometimes the background we use an outdoor acrylic paint from the hardware store that we can get in a larger quantity. All right, I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, here's a few examples of some inspiring signs. We've got at the very top an example from a pre-K site that we used to work with really in depth, and those are actually the lyrics to a song that the kids sung on a regular basis, and they did all the lettering and the backgrounds on those signs. Just sort of a fun way to create art in the space and sort of words of encouragement. Below that is actually a holding wall. I forget exactly what they're called. It was a large cement wall that wasn't looking as fresh as people wanted it to look. And so instead of creating wooden signage, this is at UPO at Eagle Academy on Wheeler Road. They decided they really wanted a simple mural. And so we helped outline and do painting, and we broke it into sections, so it was really easy for kids and families to do this together. And so just this really beautiful day where we got to paint a giant wall. So another way of just working with whatever your school community has. If you've got a wall, that's a great place for signage. If you've got a fence, great place to hang it. All right, next slide. Informative signage. So getting into some of the more in-depth information, which is always tricky, especially if you're working with paint and trying to write things. In the upper left-hand corner, this is an example from Cardoza High School. And the youth at the high school decided because their space is really open and people are often coming through it, they really wanted to communicate to neighbors and passersby what was happening in their space, how the produce was being used, why they were doing certain things. And so they made several signs like this that explained what was happening in the garden and how the space was cared for. And then the smaller circles have chalkboard paint in the center so that they could easily write what was growing in each of their beds and when they planted it, and predicted harvest dates so that people had information on things. To the right, we've got a rules sign example. We typically have sort of simple rules. These are ones we use frequently, and I think similar to a lot of signs I see in other school gardens, explore gently, respect all living things, request before we digest. So something sort of simple that sets the tone for the space. And then at the very bottom left is sort of an example of a cumulative sign project that was a part of a larger unit that group at DC Bilingual of, I think, 3rd and 4th graders quite a while back did. And they actually interviewed either parents or grandparents or neighbors or teachers about sort of their favorite dishes. And out of that, they developed, after doing interviews with family as well as neighborhoods and neighborhood friends, as well as a few restaurant owners, they created a bunch of different signs that talked about how different vegetables that they were growing in their space were used in different cuisines, and how there's a lot of overlap in how different herbs are used. And so they actually did all of the art and writing on these signs and just did a beautiful, beautiful job. And I think one of the really interesting pieces of this is not only did they get to share all of this knowledge and learn so much within their school, but they also had a lot of neighbors and passersby stop and read the signs and sort of get really excited about all of their hard work. All right, next. All right, I think we can move on to the next slide when you have a chance, Lara. Thank you. All right, so, sorry, back one slide. I think I spoke too soon. All right, so in addition to more of the written signage, I love getting to see all of the art and nonverbal signs that can be incorporated into different green spaces. These are a few examples of ways that can happen, but there's endless different ways. At the very top, you see some chalkboard signs, which are really fun because they're really interactive and allow for posting inquiries as well as creating drawing sessions. And they also allow for the space to sort of constantly change and reflect the work of the students who've been there most recently. In the very middle, we have pictures that were taken by a youth staff member at Mighty Greens, which is a part of City Blossoms program at both Eastern High School and Cardoza High School. And then we printed the pictures. One of the youth staff took all the pictures, and then we printed them on engineering paper just at Staples. It's not super pricey, pretty easy to do, and then wheat pasted them to the brick wall. And so this usually lasts like 2 to 3 seasons, and it kind of works out really nicely because usually by the time one of the pictures start to fade away, it's kind of a nice chance to update and show some of the new faces that are working in the space. And so they've sort of continually had those on it as an exhibit. And this is also a really good way if you want something that's a bit more informational and has more text, to print it out and post it on a wall, or if you don't have a fence that's easy to attach signs to use a brick wall to attach something like that. And then we've also got some faces that were made out of scrap wood, and different kids painted different portions of the sign. So like someone did the nose, a few people did the eyes, and then my coworker sort of pulled together some of the different pieces and made a few little additions. All right, next slide, please. All right, here's just a few more examples of some recycled art that has been fun to incorporate into spaces. And if anyone's curious about these projects in more depth, feel free to reach out. We've got some bike wheels that a bike shop said were just no longer usable, and kids took old cloth and wove them into the spokes to prevent pinched fingers, but also to create sort of a more colorful display, and we actually made it so that they could spin, so it sort of continually was interactive. And next to that, we've got some recycled flowers. These are actually mostly made of milk carton petals, and so kids took permanent markers and drew their petals and then painted them, and then it was the adult job to cut out the petals because that part is less fun. But all of the painting was very kid-centric. And next to that was a slightly older group of students, but they collected different bottles, caps, and other things that could easily be repurposed to create faces. And then they wrote sort of backstories, and some of the glue was reinforced with wire or screws. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Emma, who's going to talk about, these are sort of a few ideas on ways in which you can go about your signage projects, and she's going to talk a little bit more about process and sort of how to manage some of these things with your classroom, because obviously managing a really big group of students trying to use outdoor paint that's going to stay on everyone is going to get a little overwhelming. And so she's going to share out a few ways that we've used to help make that feel a little less crazy. So we'll go to the next slide and turn it over to her.
Thank you, Willa. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma, and like Brianne said, I work with the School Garden Partners program with City Blossoms. And as Willa said, it can be, at least in my experience, pretty intimidating to take on the start of a sign project when you have 35, say, third graders, and you're not really sure which steps to take. So we just wanted to talk about some ones that have worked really well for us a little bit. On the picture on the left, you can see some of the process. So that was from a garden workshop that I did with fifth graders. We did a designing an ecosystem workshop, and part of that project for them was going through the process of designing what they wanted their sign to look like. Like Willa said, they picked out some colors, they picked out some shapes, they picked out themes, and you can see their drawings clipped to the wood there. So as a staff, we went through their ideas and we picked some that we thought would look really cool and would work really well, and then transposed them onto the wood. So you can see how they inspired us there. And then we drew them out and we cut them out of the wood. We use a jigsaw when we do shapes like that. We also sanded the wood down so it would have nice smooth edges. And we sand down the corners a lot, so you can tell with the sunflower shape that there are pointed edges, but we try to sand those down so that if a young kid is running through the garden and they accidentally scrape by a sign, it's not going to be catastrophic with one tool that we use. And then if you go over to the right, you can see how the kids became involved again. So these are third graders from the same school, and they picked up where the older kids left off and really started the painting process. So the signs, when they got their hands on them, they were all cut, sanded, primed, and ready to go. And then you can kind of see how we use these different tools to manage the painting process so that everyone has a good time. So they have paint shirts on. We brought those in. They're on a big fabric tarp that we laid on the ground outside, and they're also in really small groups. So this was a big class. I think it was actually 2 classes combined. It might have been around 30 students, but we broke them up into really small groups so that they all fit around the sign. There's less, excitement over who gets the paint where. Another really good option is if you have a big group, you can break it up in 2. And if you have a teaching assistant, half of the class can be in the garden doing some kind of scavenger hunt and the other half can be painting. We did this as one big group, just broken up into really small pieces. They're using small brushes here, like Willa mentioned in the other photo. We tend to do that. We find it more manageable with kids. It also takes them a little bit more time and they're a little bit more careful. They only have a small amount of paint allocated to them. When they have the whole jug, that can be a little bit harder to handle and can be a little exciting. So they have a small amount of paint there. Yeah, and they did a really great job. we had a lot of fun. After we were done, we just put these signs off in a safe corner in the garden, and then they were all ready to go. We did some prompting about what kind of paint we're using, obviously, and that it'll stay in clothes. And we did have an incident where a little girl, when she was removing her paint shirt, got some in her hair. So watch out for that, but she was okay. And overall, it went really well. And I think we're done with this one. Can I have the next slide, please, Laura? Perfect. Okay, so this is what it turned out to be in the end. We took these flowers that the kids generated and we put them all around the border of the garden. So it's a nice cue about where the garden is and isn't, and kind of helps with the transition, I think. And the way that we finished this project was with the help of some volunteers in a community workday. So our staff prepped the signs with Sharpie. You can see that there's little details in the different color work here. So we prepped that beforehand, just really showing where each color goes. And then again, you can include kids and you can include adult volunteers, and everyone can work together just using the same strategies. Yeah, I think that's it. Can I have the next one, please, Laura? Okay, so here's another example. This is from a second grade class where we did a workshop about garden creatures. So in their classes, they learned all about native birds, so birds that are really local to their neighborhood. We learned about what different species look like, what they eat, what kind of habitats they live in, why they might come to the garden. And then in the end, this was a culminating project. So in the left corner, you can see that's where they made their bird drawings based on the different species. And then again, we had staff cut, sand, and prime the signs. And we actually had a very talented intern this season, and she transposed the drawings of the kids onto these big pieces of wood. And one thing that we find helpful when we do that is just remembering that bigger spaces for kids to paint within is usually helpful. I kind of think about it as a paint by numbers activity sometimes, just reminding myself to have very clear borders and very clear sections. And another thing that I find helpful is so for example, the cardinal, if I knew that I wanted the middle of it to be red, but maybe the beak could be a different color, you can cue the kids by putting a little splotch of red in that section and then a little splotch of black in another so that they can follow that. It's especially helpful if you're working with younger kids. May I have the next slide, please, Dora? Perfect. And then this is what they ended up looking like. The crow is my favorite. I just think it's a really cute kid design. And we, again, put them around the border, so it's a nice visual cue when kids are entering the garden, moving from a classroom space or maybe a recess space into the outdoor classroom. The cardinal on the right ended up looking great. The group who did that did a great job. I think that this is a good example of how sometimes some touch-up help by some adult hands can be very successful, because the group who did this found a bug on their sign in the middle of painting it, and they had a paintbrush that they used to chase down the bug, which I think worked pretty well, but it also ended with a very elaborate squiggle in the middle of the sign. But I just went through afterward and got that same paint that we used for the background color and touched it up, and now it looks beautiful and it's still very kid done. But I think sometimes knowing that you can go back and touch it up later is at least helpful to remind myself if we find a bug on our sign and we end up chasing it with a paintbrush. It has happened. All right, thanks, Laura. So that is what we had prepared about signage so far. And then we wanted to transition into talking about storage and organization, because we think that it's another helpful tool for when you're managing outdoor classrooms, especially if there's a lot of educators using the space. So some strategies that we found useful is keeping things close. So if there are a lot of people using the garden and there are materials that you use a lot of the time, having them in the space itself can be really helpful, because I think if you're constantly transporting things back and forth from the school building, that can be overwhelming and be an inhibiting factor on if you're using the space or not. So we just really like being able to keep things close. We tend to use sheds or some kind of storage container that has shelving because it's easier to allocate things in different places. So you can label the shelves, you can label the bins that you're putting into the shelves, and then it's easier to create a system so that if multiple teachers are using the space, everyone knows where things are. Another thing that we keep in mind is that when we're storing food in these spaces, which we often do, we use cooking boxes at City Blossoms and we keep garden pantries in the sheds. We just remind ourselves to make sure those bins are always covered because, you know, gardens are beautiful ecosystems full of many different creatures, and we welcome that, but we don't want them in our food. And they do sometimes get in the shed. So just remembering to cover all of your food is useful. Making a cleaning system can also be helpful. I think planning for that is a little bit more necessary than at least I'd realized, just so everyone knows how we're cleaning, you know, where is the sponge, where is the dish soap. We use a 3-bin system for when we're cleaning dishes at City Blossom. So it's just helpful to have everyone aware of that. We also organize things by activity. We found that more useful than, you know, putting all of the scissors in one place or markers in another, but just having a box of, I know if I'm teaching this kind of lesson, I can go in here and I have everything that I need for this field trip. I think that's also helpful in avoiding the catch-all bin. I think if we're in the garden and we're moving really fast, a lot of times we like to just throw things into one container, and it's useful in the moment, but it can get confusing later. So if you have smaller bins that are organized by activity, it can avoid that problem. And also if you keep everything covered with a lid, for some reason, that tends to keep you out of that habit in our experience. So those are just some of the things that we keep in mind when we're managing our storage. I think we're all good. Thanks, Laura.
Okay, and you'll notice here this beginning section is really about sort of the logistics and the materials piece, because as you know from trying to organize spaces in your classrooms, how you set up your classroom, how you set up that space is integral to outdoor group management in general. How your garden is set up right now isn't necessarily how you would like your garden to be set up in the future. But there are some key things to consider, as Evan from Outteach talked a lot about previously. Having circles or benches for gathering spaces. You can see in this picture on the right, this is Henley Elementary in Ward 8. You can see that there are benches, and on that side, there's also a chalkboard space for them to use. It's really helpful to have that space as you bring your group out to be able to orient them to the garden. But you may not have benches. You may not have a big seating space like that already set up. And there are tools that you can use to sort of create more flexible seating. Or let's say you want to break out a smaller group in a different space than where you have that. And so you can see in the picture in the bottom, Dwayne, who you heard on week 1, he's using garden kneeling pads here as sort of impromptu seating. It really helps to give students a space that they know is their own. And garden kneeling pads can be a great way to do that. They can help you define where spaces are sort of around a garden bed, but they can also be used in open areas as well. And they're not very expensive and not very hard to store in a bin or pull around to different areas. So I highly, highly recommend using them for when you want impromptu seating somewhere. In addition, you can see a picnic table in the top one. Picnic tables are awesome for small group works, and it can be great to have one picnic table in one area and another picnic table in another area. But if you don't have picnic tables, or if you find yourself continually needing a space to set up materials or a space to, you know, collect things at the end, the small folding tables can be really awesome. They can fit in just about any shed that you may have. Costco sells a really good affordable version, and it can be a great way to make your space more usable, just having an elevated place to be able to put things. And so that is, I think, spending a little bit of time to think about how you will use your space on an ongoing basis is really important, because if you have to send students into the garden shed to be able to get a supply that you need, that is going to be much harder for you to manage them than if they are already out where you need them to be. In addition, in that same sort of concept of being able to use all of your garden space for activities, these little chalk A-frame boards, or sometimes they sell them in whiteboard too. You can also make your own. They're really great for being able to set up materials or set up an agenda or set up, you know, sort of directions in different parts of the garden. And they don't require that you install a whiteboard. You can move them where you need them to be. And that flexibility is really key. Pathways are also really helpful in moving people around your space. But if you don't have pathways, you can use signs. You can navigate people through in different ways. And then I also just want to advocate for shade, especially in those summer months. Shade sails are beautiful and they certainly help a lot, but you may find that there are different spaces that you want to use, and a shade sail or the building is not going to do it for you at that time. It may just even be that normally the section is in shade, but from 2 to 4 in the afternoon it's not, and that's when you have your ability to be able to go out into the class. And so $100 or $200 pop-up tent can make a big difference in allowing you to be able to use your space when you actually need to. And then I had forgotten this, but Willa actually did a great job of reminding me that there is so much power in a 5-gallon bucket. They are cheap and they can make excellent seats. They can carry your trowels. They can be a device to help kids water using cups. They can be your compost mover. They can, you know, contain your art supplies. They can be little individual buckets for every student so that they have all of their own supplies. But a 5-gallon bucket is cheap and can be used in any number of different ways. And oftentimes you can get them free from places that do a lot of food. For instance, there were many years of my life in which every bucket I ever used was from a pickle factory. And then there was another where I would always go back to a place I had worked that had a big bubble exhibit, and I would take all of their old soap buckets that they had. So there's always ways to get buckets too. They're just a great resource. Next slide. I also, when we think about how we use a space and how that plays into group management, setting up different spaces in your garden can really help you better use your garden with your students. You are probably going to have times where one student is not engaged with your activity, or they're just not connecting with where you are, or they're frustrated, or different things are happening. And being able to have a space where they can take a mental break can be huge. Some great options for this, dig beds are really great for this. Now, having a consistent dig bed can be an option, but as you can imagine, if it's the same soil, it's the same dirt over time, there wind up being less bugs, less living things in it. And so one thing that I actually really recommend is just to have a sign that says dig here. And then anytime you have an empty bed or one that you've just harvested and removed all the plants from, use that sign and put it there, and that's your dig bed. And then you can tell that student, hey, go find the dig bed, dig for a little bit. When you're ready to come back, come back. That can be such a powerful tool. And then sometimes you can use weaving stations as a great way to have students go and gather material and bring it in, but also to take a break from whatever is happening. You can see in this picture on the right here, Emma, our garden coordinator, last year, she put together this great structure using just eye hooks and bamboo poles. Now we're lucky we often have bamboo poles around, but they're not a very expensive thing, and it's easy to drill the eye hooks in them, and then you just lace them with string and they're ready for kids to be able to weave into. If that's not an option, another option is you can make great weaving structures. Like this example on the left is actually just a simple weaving frame made out of sticks. And maybe you actually have each student that has their own, and that can be an option anytime. Hey, this space isn't working for you right now. How about you go add to your weaving? That can be an option too. And then lastly, I also really encourage, if you have a take a break chair in your classroom, have one in the garden too. And even better if that spot can be surrounded by sensory plants, surrounded by tactile experiences, things that they can touch or smell, or not so much taste maybe, but hear. That's going to allow them to focus on what they're experiencing in nature, because that will allow them to recenter and be willing and able to come back with the group. A similar idea to this, it's a very core nature connection practice, is this idea of a sit spot. And it's really something that you can do anywhere where you have some natural space. It can be a garden. It could be, this picture on the bottom left is our Nature Explorer classroom. The basic idea of a sit spot is you could send your group out into that space and say, find a space where you can be sitting independently on your own, and just let them sit and observe what's happening around them. What do they see? What do they hear? What do they smell? And if you introduce that as an activity that you do regularly, especially in the beginning, that then becomes a tool that you can use throughout. Go find your sit spot. It can be a really powerful feature in any school garden. It requires some setup in the beginning to really think about how you will use it, but then it can be a really good mindfulness practice and nature connection practice for them in their school gardens. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, and of course, gardening activities themselves can be really excellent mindful activities. Those 5-gallon buckets, fill them with water, give students a little Dixie cup or a small cup, and they can go around and water things themselves. You don't have to worry about them putting too much water on things. That can be a great activity to focus on too. As can digging, as can weeding, especially if you've set up your beds so that you have really 1 or 2 things growing in a garden. And so they know anything that's, or not in a garden, but in a garden bed. And they know anything that's not that, they can pull out. That is an awesome activity to do as well. Next slide, please. Of course, when you are outside, when you are using your school garden, it totally depends on the structure of your school garden, what it looks like, how big it is, how long it is. On the left here, we have our Friendship Armstrong garden, which is pretty self-contained by sidewalks and the parking lot. And so there, it's very easy for us to be able to say, you know, hey, this is where we're staying today. We're staying on the wood chips, or we're staying off the sidewalk or anything like that. But when you go to our KIPP garden, it is a very long garden. And so where we want them to go requires that we think about, what are we asking them to do? What's the activity that we're having them do? And really think about, how are we going to get them there? For instance, if you have older kids and your space, this KIPP garden, again, is on a big slant. There's a big hill on the side there. If you're working with a group of 5th graders out there, it may be sufficient to say, hey, we're staying on the flat ground and not going down the hill. But if you're working with a group of kindergartners, as you know, you may have to be more specific, like keep your feet on the stones, or keep your feet on the wood chips. And so think about how you are actually going to tell them where you want them to go during that. A super helpful feature for this, which is why we started with signage, is signage. If it's labeled, if there are big signs to sort of let them know what parts of the garden that they're in, you can also use them to really design where you want them to go. And then I also just want to give a little call out. Oftentimes, this was referenced even in our gardening basics session, was that people said, well, we don't have fences, we don't really want chain link fences, we don't want that sort of look. Sometimes boundaries, visual reminders can be really helpful. This is the space that you're staying. And that can be especially helpful if your garden is not already sort of tucked away from something, but is really right on the street. And I encourage you to think about how can you make your fence itself, whether it's through signage or planting like this trumpet vine here on the right, you can make your boundaries, real boundaries, but also a little bit more beautiful, living boundaries that can be a part of the visual engagement of your space. And it can be this trumpet vine that's here. It is a Maryland native, although can be a little bit invasive. But it is going to grow up a chain link fence just fine. But you may also consider, do you need shrubs? Do you want some other sort of planting that's going to help demarcate? So it is very helpful to think about how you are dividing your space and how are you going to explain to your students where you're going to have them go in these different capacities. Next slide. So we've talked a lot here about some of the physical features, some of the signs, some of those physical cues that you're going to use in your school garden, and especially, even organization, how you're going to help other teachers be able to come in and use the space as well. But anytime we talk about outdoor group management, it starts with how we plan our lessons. And this came up in many of you in your comments when we asked what your challenges were. How do I deal with a whole group activity out here? And to some extent, that's what we're going to dive into now. First, we're going to start with a little bit about what we think of as core facilitated activities. Those activities that really are sort of best led by a teacher with a smaller group of students. And then, because that can be really hard to do, we're going to dive into what are other activities that you can set up so that you can work in those small groups, so that you can really engage in specific conversations with different students. Next slide. So first, science in the garden. I want to say first that experiments and science in the garden can definitely be a really important facilitated activity that you do in your garden. And I want to say that kids are natural scientists. The way that they move and explore through the world is with this unending curiosity. And to some extent, especially at younger ages, part of our job is just to provide some coaching or a little bit of coaxing to really get them to think about how they are exploring their spaces and how they are being scientists. So even just going out into the garden, just that activity is going to present more opportunities for science than you may necessarily have in your classroom. But I want to talk a little bit about some of our favorite, more facilitated science in the garden activities. And for me, I come with a long background of teaching science in all different settings. And for me, seed starting is the absolute best way to teach real scientific method at a very young age. You can really dive into what is a problem, what is a hypothesis, what do you think is going to happen, and how are you going to make it happen, all through, and variables, what are little tweaks or changes that we can sort of compare. And obviously, as you go up in age, you can do more and more with the scientific method and with that process. But at the beginner level, at earlier ages, this can look like this activity on the left, which I'm sure many of you have done or seen done. In fact, this is from Summer Institute 2 years ago. We're doing seed starting with lima beans and corn. And it's just a way, or seed sprouting. It's just a way to actually make visible what usually happens underground, which is that seed soaking up water and then growing and coming to life. And these sorts of activities are great ways to introduce to young people, sort of really make it obvious to them what's happening when they put their seed in the ground. So I almost like to do that one right alongside doing planting in the ground, so they can really see it. But in terms of variables, in terms of thinking about introducing experimentation, there's so much more that you can do. As you can see on this picture on the right, these are some of our green ambassadors, our high school students that are really starting seeds for us that will go into our greenhouse. And we do this with our K-5 students as well, just on a smaller scale. But you can introduce all different sorts of variables around how much are you watering? How often do you water? What do two different types of seeds look like when they grow? How long does it take for each of them to grow? And of course, what always happens anytime you do seed starting with kids is, why did my seed not grow? That always happens. So little tidbit on that one, always, especially when you're working with younger students, make sure you plant 2 seeds, or maybe even 3, depending on how old or how small your seeds are. Just increase the odds that something will grow there. But seed starting is such a fantastic way to introduce the scientific method and all the sorts of variables that can go into that. But it can also just be, we have a pot in our garden, and any kid who wants to bring the seed out from their snack, from their pear or their apple or whatever they happen to have gotten that day, and put it in this pot and see what happens, that's a great thing to do too. And really fun to see what starts to happen. So that is a little bit about seed starting. I will say for this one, we already have our Washington Youth Gardens K-2 seed starting curriculum in the Schoology website, so you could take a look at that and play around a little bit with that one more. But I'm going to pass it back over to Emma to talk about some of their favorite science in the garden activities. Next slide.
Thanks, Brianne. All right, so we want to talk first about habitat surveys. We really like doing this one with kids, and we think it's pretty adaptable to different ages. So on the left, you can see where in a 5th grade classroom, we were learning all about the energy flow in a garden ecosystem. We were learning about the different kinds of consumers and decomposers and how that mechanism just all works together, which I really like doing that unit with students, and I think that they did a really good job with it. One of the ways that we used habitat surveys in this lesson was to reinforce these new concepts. So in the classroom, we practiced with different pictures and matching different native animals into these different categories. And then we were able to transition out into the garden and do a survey and see how many of each type of consumer was in their garden and which kinds were there and which weren't. So the way that we did this is, I guess there are multiple different ways to do it, but some useful tools. You can break up the garden into different sections and have small groups survey different pieces so that you can either do, a sample size of the whole garden or cover the full space, depending on how big your garden is and how big your group is. Some helpful tools for that, we use, if we're doing really small spaces, we use string, like a very bright color, so you can give each group a little circle and say that they're looking in this area and you're finding how many individuals you see there. You can also use surveyor's tape, or you can use natural boundaries, like this group is gonna look at these 3 raised beds and so on. From there, we launched into a research project that was really based in literacy skills. They did a lot of writing and reading about particular individuals that are native to their area, but you can take it a bunch of different ways. You could also do a count of how many individuals you see each time, and then you can make a graph of that so you can see trends in the data that way. You can do a survey at different times of year and invite the kids to wonder how the numbers of individuals will change based on the season, different things like that. There's a lot of really great possibilities. On the right is a picture of Willa with some younger kids, and they're doing a version of a habitat survey. This happened really naturally at a work day, but they're looking at swallowtail caterpillars, and they're noting how many they see in the carrot bed, and Willa talked them through a little bit why you might see so many of this kind of animal in that space. Carrots are just a really good habitat for that kind of organism, so you can take that approach to it as well. May I have the next slide, please? Perfect. So compost and decomposition is also a really nice starting off point if you're looking to do some observation or some experiments. You can see some useful tools at play here. We've started using hula hoops in the garden to allocate different spaces to different groups of kids. And here they have their spot and they're observing the compost there. You can pull compost from different bins. So compost that you know is in different stages of decomposition, and you can have the kids count how many creatures that they see in each stage and wonder why there might be more in a different layer. That's an interesting experiment to do with them. On the right, some younger kids have magnifying glasses. We really like to use those kid-friendly magnifying glasses to make observations. They might also be useful for a different kind of decomposition experiment where you can take something really simple like a banana peel and watch how it changes in a compost pile over a series of days or weeks. You can also do a comparison where you take something that's biodegradable like a banana peel and compare it to a plastic bag and see how they each change over time in the compost bin and ask the kids to wonder about why. So that can be an interesting discovery for them. We find that kids really like to explore the dirt and they really like to search for worms and see the different creatures that they find. So it's an interesting way to follow their excitement, and they can also do some scientific illustrations about the different creatures they see and learn about the parts of an insect. So there are a lot of different options there. All right, I think Willa's going to talk to us a little bit about cooking.
All right, I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but cooking, yeah, one of the most exciting classes that you can have, usually a great way to connect to what's growing and get everyone excited about class. And if anyone doesn't have access to a full kitchen and is interested in ways to cook without using a more traditional kitchen, on the Schoolology website will be our free resources list, and we have a cooking box list with some of our favorite tools. And on that note, I will jump to the activity station, and I think we're going to take a pause for a quick Slido poll as well. All right. So the Slido poll is, do you already use kits in your classroom or garden? For this use, a kit is a material a student can work with on more independently. All right, it looks like a lot of people are using their kits already in classrooms. So we're gonna, in a little bit, jump into some of our favorite stations or kits that we like to use out in the garden in a really similar way. So when we're thinking about activity stations for gardens, definitely always feels really helpful to have all of that stuff in your garden shed so you don't have to be hauling it from the classroom if at all possible. And some of these stations, whether they're sort of physically already set up in the garden, so it's a particular place that that activity always happens, or if it's a box that has all the materials that you need and you can just take it out when you need it, can really help when you want to get down to that smaller, more focused group of students for a more structured activity. One strategy that a lot of schools that we work with have used is at the very beginning of the school year, trying to run through all of the stations so that they sort of become super habitual. Everyone knows what to do. Maybe kids can even help set up some of those stations. And that way, when you get into doing some of your more focused things, you can easily just let things kind of happen a little bit more naturally. So we're going to jump into a few of our favorite stations. I'm going to keep it short so we save time for questions at the end as well. So I'll go on to the next slide, please. All right, imaginative play, having some kind of music that can be incorporated into your space, whether it's a box or a wall. The only slight problem with the wall is obviously you can't put it away, so music making can be tempting at all times and might be distracting when you don't want it to be. But having a music box that you can put away is also super helpful. Another box that we love having is just a box of like scarves or fabric and ribbons and string. To the right, there's a kid at the Seton Garden stage, and he's playing with some ribbons that they've hung up there. But also just having them in a box and being able to tie them wherever, sort of as decoration or as a part of play, can be a really interesting way to see how their play leads to lots of innovative ideas. All right, and we'll go to the next slide. A garden library. So we tend to just keep a box of books in the shed for a lot of the year. So again, super easy to pull out and create sort of a quiet reading corner. Even if kids can't read, if you're worried about destroying the books, there are some like non-destroy books that seem to pretty much live up to their word of not being able to be torn and are pretty waterproof if you want to go with that route, or just having a quiet corner where like a few books go out and it's a nice place to sit and connect. If anyone's interested in more ideas for nature and food themed books, we put together a library a few years back, and it's on our website if anyone is interested in checking that out. And we'll jump to nature art. All right, so these are a few things. A lot of this isn't even stuff that we have, that it can just be found easily in the space. But having a box of chalk, whether you're chalking a wall or rain barrels or logs or sidewalks, the chalk's gonna wash off, or you can have a more traditional chalkboard and go with that. But it can be a really fun way to see how kids interact with the space and also explore texture. If you're using chalk over some bark, you might sort of explore texture in a different way than you might otherwise do if you're just running your hand across it. And next to our chalk drawing, we've got someone making a nature bracelet. And this is just taking a piece of tape and putting the sticky side out. Once you've done this a few times and the tape bracelet is on everyone's arms, it's pretty independent and can, again, just be a fun way to interact with the space, explore different colors. And then creating sort of either nature faces or mandalas or manipulating sort of leaves and twigs can be really fun for creating really interesting art and sort of less consciously exploring texture and all the different things going around us in the garden, and is sort of super meditative. And so sometimes we'll pre-pick some of these things and even start an example to help inspire or just get people started. But after you've done it a few times, we definitely find students getting really excited to create new installations. And we don't tend to glue anything down. So sometimes if someone's really excited about their nature masterpiece, we'll take a picture of it and maybe later on laminate it so that it can hang somewhere else, either in the classroom or somewhere in the garden, so that it's preserved for a bit longer. We'll go on to the next slide. Watering. This is definitely one of the favorite activities in a lot of our spaces. I put these two pictures here because the picture on the left has a whole bunch of kids and 3 adults present to support, and is obviously not an independent activity. One of the things that we've started doing a lot, again, Brianne mentioned earlier, doing sort of smaller containers for filling water, but just having a bucket of water out so that kids can fill up their own watering can, sort of making it a really independent activity. Sometimes ends up being a bit more wet, but if they can either fill up their own cans with a bucket or a rain barrel, it'll make it a lot more doable. And we'll go on to the next slide. Loose parts. Every single shed that we have has a random box of really odd looking things, possibly to some, but often ends up being a favorite activity and can be used for so many different ideas. On the right, we have some kids who were having a building competition, and there are lots of different categories. There was a category for structure, for height, for aesthetics, and at the end they presented them, but for most of that time, they were completely independent once that box had been taken out of the shed. And it was really fun to just hear some of the conversations that were happening in terms of problem solving and figuring out how to stack things. The picture on the left are some of the things we enjoy. I would encourage a lot of sanding for all of these things, but they hold up over time, and most of it was stuff we already had laying around because we were building raised beds, little pieces of wood, bark that had been found, PVC pipe, especially if you can have both whole and cut longwise pieces, can make interesting bridges or chutes, and you can play with water in those ways as well. Dowels, that kind of thing. And we'll go on to the next slide. And this is probably some of our loose parts in action. So having, again, Brianne mentioned this earlier, a digging bed, a bed that's okay to just explore, whether you're looking for worms or creating a mud kitchen, having a box of kitchen tools that are okay to go and get muddy, maybe label them, not food safe or something like that, so you don't end up making a salad with the strainer that you just doused in mud. But this is one of the favorite activities and can definitely be a really creative way for independent activity. And on that note, I'm gonna pass it off to Brianne, I think.
Thanks, Willa. So I just want to do a plug here for independent work as a way to be able to break out your students into different groups so you can really focus on a smaller group. And there are a lot of tools that already exist to help you be able to do this, and or that you can adapt for whatever it is that you're doing. One of my personal favorite is a scavenger hunt. You know, if you are working on science and you're talking about plant parts, you can devise a plant part scavenger hunt, which is what you see here. But it could also be about insects or what they find. There are lots of existing scavenger hunts that already are out there that you can use as well. But it can be an activity that you really have a part of their group, especially if they're a little older, work on completely independently. And then Sometimes it might be about categorizing. You can see over on the right this beautiful array of paint chips that they've been able to gather materials and put on there. That looks very beautiful. I usually recommend instead having the students walk around with the paint chips and having them find what color matches. I will also, nature journaling can be a great tool to do out here, and give them some space for that. But I'm going to put a plug out here too for if there's independent work that you do in your classroom, if you do independent reading or you do independent writing or anything else, is there a way you can figure out to do that in the garden? I think in general, the benefits of being outside are really high. And I think especially right now, as we're thinking about how we are inside together versus how we are outside, sometimes just making that a common thing that you do is you bring your independent reading time, you're all outside, can be really powerful. And I just want to share a little bit about this activity down here at the bottom, the cucumber drawing and the cucumber plants. This is one of my favorite activities as a garden educator. I think so often we wind up holding a lot of the knowledge and sort of doling it out. And I'm always trying to uncenter myself as a garden educator and figure out ways for how I can really put our students in control of their own exploration. And so you can see this is an example of this. It's just a drawing of the plant. Oftentimes when you see signs, especially of food, it will be a drawing that just includes the part that you eat. We specifically put the whole plant, all different parts, so that you can give them their stick with their card on it with the drawing and say, go find your plant in the garden. You know, have one of these for every single thing that's out there. And it is really fun, and it is a great way for them, especially in the beginning, to really sort of go explore the garden. So I highly recommend activities like that. Again, I'm going to reiterate the sit spot as a great sort of feature that you can add in, just as a quiet moment of meditation and observation in your school gardens. And then next slide, Laura. Some helpful tools to be able to make this happen, aside from the garden kneeling pads. Clipboards. Oh, clipboards, they're such a good tool. They mean that you can bring worksheets out into the garden, but they also help organize materials. And for anybody who, especially right now, is concerned about everyone having their own materials, they actually make aluminum clipboards that have space underneath, so you could have all of your students' materials in that aluminum clipboard, so that is their clipboard to carry everything with. There are ways to do it. Other helpful tools are exploratory materials, hand lenses, and in fact, somebody asked in the chat box, do we have recommendations? I love these hand lenses that are in this middle picture here. They're big. Are they the best hand lenses? No, but for littles, I find them to be fantastic, and they're not unbreakable. I'm sure you could break them, but they are pretty sturdy. And a really fun tool to be able to use. The weather station too that Evan talked about previously, and then of course having a kit of prepared activities like scavenger hunt cards or like paint chips can be really helpful too. And I loved the suggestion that Willa and Emma had shared previously, that they actually, just like hand lenses, they use tweezers too, so they can give students an opportunity to go off and explore how might you use tweezers like that in the garden. So those are just some helpful tools that you might be able to use in your school garden. Next slide. The most important thing that you can do anytime you're taking a group of students outside is to set the tone for them. One of the things that we often face as we bring students outside into school gardens for learning is that their expectation of outside time is that outside time is playtime. And if you want outside time to be learning time, you have to set the tone for them just like you would for your class time. Next slide. So the first, if you do nothing else, I think having garden agreements, you saw them in some of the signs that Willa shared at some of their gardens. Having some garden agreements is crucial for really being able to set up your garden as a learning space. How you make that happen kind of depends on some things. You may have standard garden agreements for everyone in your school, or you may have garden agreements for your class. And so you can see in these pictures, there's a big painted sign with garden agreements on the right. That might be something as if all classes have the same agreements. But if you have your individual garden agreements, you may have just a paper laminated sign that you all bring out with you and place on a wall or something like that. And then if you don't have any of those things, or for us on our field trips, we're bringing students out into a new space. And so we actually introduce them always verbally. And you can see that on the left, an example of us circling up and reminding students and introducing students to garden agreements. So real quick, I'm going to ask you all to head to Slido one more time. Well, again, there will probably be one more, to see what do you already use for your garden agreements. Honesty, I love it. I don't have any. I love it. It's very helpful. It's very helpful. I think you probably saw our garden agreements on there. We use pick with permission, stay on the path, and respect all living things. Garden agreements are most helpful when they're simple, when they're easy to follow, and when one agreement can sort of apply to many different things. My favorite is respect all living things. And I see it popping up a couple of times here, because respecting all living things means me as you know, the leader, or as an adult in the group, but it also means your friends, and it also means the insects and the plants and everything else. And so I really love that one. But I love some of the suggestions in here. Use gentle hands. Love your gardens. That's a great one too. So much shows up to how you would show love for your garden. Move slowly. These are some really great ones. If there was one takeaway I would encourage you all, just one from this whole session, I would say think about what you want your garden agreements to be, and how will you in your classroom and other classes that are using set up their garden agreements as a tool that they'll use in classroom management, because it is really, really helpful. Feel free to keep sharing if you've got more and you haven't been able to do so, but we'll go back to the slide just because we're running low on time. Okay, and then Emma, I think you're going to share about this one.
I am. Thanks, Brianne. So we just wanted to touch on this really quickly, that songs and movement can be a really great tool for setting the tone, especially during transitions if you're moving between areas in the garden, but also I find if you're moving between the classroom and the garden. So in this picture, we're inside, we're in class, and I tend to start with a circle and either a movement series or a song. Here we're doing plant part yoga, which I learned at the youth garden with Brianne. I think it's really helpful, and I just really like it as a tool for channeling the energy, like channeling the excitement of going outside in a really affirmative way. And I also think it's useful to do it in the classroom and then again when we're outside, because I think that's where I risk losing attention a lot, is when we've actually entered the garden and all of a sudden we're really overwhelmed with our feelings. Circling back up, I think, is a nice tool for continuity, so that the kids are reminded that it's an outdoor classroom and we're still in this learning headspace. So we've listed a lot of our songs here, and then I think we're also gonna share resources with the lyrics and the tunes for some of these if you'd like to use them.
I will say my personal favorite, I'm not necessarily such a song person, but I love movement ones. And so my personal favorite is, if you're walking a group of students through the garden, is to have them walk like a caterpillar, and you're the head and then they're all your legs. But we're all one body, so we gotta stay walking together. That one's my favorite. Next slide. Just some physical things to consider when you're going out and using your outdoor space. It seems obvious, but sometimes it isn't always. Being outside is inherently different. 50 degrees when you're walking through it for a couple of minutes feels fine. But when you're out there for 30 or 45 minutes, it is cold. And so it is important to take that into consideration as you're planning when you're going to use your garden. And I would say the same thing for 90 degrees, right? A couple minutes feels fine. But the longer you're out there, the more that experience will really start to set in on you and your students. So just make sure if you're going outside when it's cold to bundle up and use all of your resources that you can for that. Then the sun, I can't tell you how many times I, as an outdoor educator, have looked around at a group of people that I'm talking to and realize I'm fine, but everyone I'm looking at is like squinting. So that means they're not paying attention to me because they're focused on their experience, what they're experiencing. So pay attention to how your students are reacting to you and where the sun is. Move yourself so that it's a little inconvenient for you, but great for them, and you'll get much more focus out of them. And then consider the wind. Paper is great, clipboards are great, but if it is windy out, it will flop everywhere, and a rubber band around a clipboard does a world of wonders. And a little bit of rain doesn't have to be scary. Sometimes you may find that your students do have the gear that they need to be able to go outside. Sometimes you may not. And so that's another time to consider that pop-up tent, or to consider what is your shelter outside so that they can go out for a little bit and then come back. But you're still mostly outside. And I would say the same thing actually about water in general. It is amazing how uncomfortable it can be if you walk outside on a cool fall morning and there's dew on the ground and all of your students' feet get wet and they're cold because of that. So strongly consider what's going on the ground and what's that experience going to be like for them. But I'm also just going to say sometimes it's the same. Just like you would in the classroom, make sure that you're getting down on their level so that when you're talking, they're able to engage with them better. Set those clear expectations, whether it's garden agreements, or make sure that you've explained the activities well. And then bathrooms and cleanup always take longer than you'd like. That is true. If you're outside, if you're inside, it always does. But bathrooms are harder to get to when you're outside. So gotta make sure that you factor that in. Next slide. Go with the flow. Oh, these two are my favorite pictures from all pictures at Washington Youth Garden. Why do we go outside? Because sometimes magic happens, right? I love this picture because on the left, she is terrified of this worm and doesn't know what it's going to do or feel or look like, but then just a little bit longer, just a little bit of time to give her that sense of comfort. Look at the joy that she has, and now she's like ready to try it. She's gonna hold that worm. And I think that same thing is true when you are outside. Sometimes you will find that you go out with a plan, but instead you find a spider web and you're gonna focus on that. Or you see pollinators and you're gonna focus on that. And so of course you have to go out with your plan, but don't lose the opportunity to be able to just go where it takes you when it's out there, because there's always fun opportunities that present themselves when you go outside. Next slide, and I think that's actually it. We have a couple of minutes, so if people have questions, I know people have been putting some stuff in the chat box already, so we can get to those. But if you have any other questions for us, feel free to add those in there now. And while you do that, I'm just gonna ask one more thing. Laura, last slide. Just to plug again, next Tuesday's discussion session is about how do we use our school gardens as a part of our COVID response. And I know that some big announcements came out today about schools, and I know y'all probably want to talk about this, and this is a good opportunity to do this. How do we continue to do outdoor education given the challenging times that we're in right now? So that is that. I just want to make sure to cover that. I'm going to throw up one more Slido that will just sort of prompt you to fill in some questions for that session to help us get thinking and planning for that. But otherwise, We'll have a minute or two to answer some questions here. Willa, I know you were looking at the chat box. Was there anything in the chat box that you want to be able to answer to the whole group?
Yeah, I think I wrote down that there was a question around how to ensure every grade level has like artistic voice in the space. That I know is a question that we ask ourselves a lot and teachers ask a lot. One thing that's been fun is to create like a school board to design the garden or design a sign project that lots of different grade levels can add to. And then it's physically out so everyone gets to see it. And a second question was around like permission to hang signs or wheat paste things on brick walls. We've typically asked administration about signage designs and made sure that it was okay with them. And then the good thing is that wheat paste is temporary, so that helps. I don't know if I missed anything else. Apologies. I will keep looking and see if there was anything else that I skipped over while I was talking.
Yeah, there is a question that just came across about hand washing stations. Yeah, hand washing stations outside are great. If you can set up a sink outside, it can be really awesome. Sometimes there are full setups for that. What we have done in the past, because there was a long time where even at our demonstration garden at the youth garden, we did not have hand washing stations or like a sink. So instead we had the big igloo coolers that we put up on the edge of a table or up on a bucket, depending on how tall or anything like that. And then we put a bucket underneath to catch the extra water. We've got some biodegradable soap. We've got a whole process too for how we walk them through from the front. Then we challenge them to make all the bubbles that they possibly can with their hands before they come back up to the front to wash their hands off. It is a way to do it. But of course, if you have a way to get a sink outside, that also makes cleaning produce and things like that a lot easier too. Any other questions that sort of came up? Willa, I also think in general, I know when we were looking to paint new signs, we came to you all and said, what is the process that you use? Because you guys, maybe, could you talk just briefly about how do you actually like paint and then, you know, finish your signs?
Yeah, definitely. We use a jigsaw to cut stuff out, but if you're just making square signs, you can get them cut at a local hardware store usually. We typically do about 2 coats of primer after doing some sanding to make sure we don't have any sharp edges that are going to catch anyone in the wrong way. And then several background coat layers. I'd say we typically have kids participate in everything except the jigsaw and sanding for fairly obvious reasons, depending on age, obviously. And then the students are really involved in all the other portions of it. I think the biggest thing is making sure with plywood that you get into the cracks with your primer and your background color. We don't tend to do any like outer coat layer, and our signs typically last, depending on how well they were done, like 4 to 6 years sometimes. They usually at least last 4 years before they start falling apart, and getting into like the layers of the plywood is key in making them last. And I'm trying to think, Emma, jump in if I'm forgetting anything, but those are sort of the main processes, I think. The folk art paints have been really great. They last really long color-wise. And they come in a lot of colors. And if anyone is interested, we do have a 1-page summary that is going to be ready soon. So we're happy to share that out with everyone, along with any other resources, or if anyone has any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Definitely check out that last Slido poll if there's anything you want to make sure that we talked to in the last discussion session. But otherwise, thanks for participating here, for joining us. We hope there was some really useful stuff for you. And we will see many of you on Tuesday for the next discussion session. And then next Thursday for our very final webinar on teaching standards-based curriculum in the garden, getting creative with how you are teaching to your standards. So thank you, presenters. Thank you to all of you, and have a great weekend.